All right. I hope everyone is back from our break. We are ready to move into our next session with Mr. Stephen Thompson, and he is going to be discussing working with Bahamian boys and men. I can tell you that I was there for the last presentation that he did, and it was absolutely amazing. He had so many wonderful nuggets of information to share. So please pay close attention to what he's going to share with you. So let me introduce you to Mr. Stephen J. Thompson. Stephen J. Thompson is the Chief Mental Health Officer and founding CEO of Thompson Counseling and Consulting, a counseling and consulting firm virtually based in the Bahamas. Stephen is a trained clinical forensic psychologist and psychotherapist and has a Master of Arts in Clinical Forensic Psychology and is going into a second year pursuing a Doctorate of Education in Organizational Leadership and Development. His research is focused on the application of theories in the workplace, such as workplace wellness, training and development, and psychological safety through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Through Stephen's work as a Chief Mental Health Officer, he continues to work with the youth, adults, and couples through the provisions of counseling and psychotherapy. He also works with organizations to develop training and learning opportunities for staff and stakeholders on a variety of topics. I present to you Mr. Stephen J. Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? If someone can give me a thumbs up. I had some difficulties last time. We good? Okay. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about working with Bahamian boys and men. And some of the topics that I'm going to be covering as we look at working with Bahamian boys and men is an introduction to the problem, understanding Bahamian boys and men, masculinity, and motivational interviewing. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of what's the problem. So when we think of our boys and our young men in our society, and even just globally, what's happening is a global epidemic. And the epidemic is essentially our boys are being overly represented in jails, failing to graduate high school, engaging in gender-based violence and other violent behaviors, as well as just simply either not living to their full potential or experiencing chronic unemployment or underemployment. And what's happening is that this is a pervasive kind of revolving door, which is directly a result of a few different things. Some of these things include not having enough or available positive male figures in their lives, essentially ongoing educational disengagement, a lack of identity or gender identity informed training for service providers, and essentially an overburdened education system. And so what we need to do, and when we look at this, is that we need to explore gender transformative communication and education, as well as motivational interviewing, and understanding some of the implications of what it means to be a man in society, and particularly for our context, Bahamian society, and for our youth workers and people that work with youth and young men in particular, to be able to be informed and trained in these particular skills. And so what do we do? Like I said, it's going to be important for us to really contextualize what it means to be a man in society. And that is as it relates to gender transformative education, which research says is the best way to kind of be able to support our youth and support men and women and all genders in being able to really push forth and navigate the world in an effective way. And when I say gender transformative education, not to be confused with gender transformation education, gender transformative education is simply the idea of understanding the implications of manliness and masculinity and femininity and gender in general, and how it impacts our roles and our places in society, how gender impacts policies, procedures, education, and so on and so forth. And so when we look at addressing some of the challenges that we experience with young boys and men, we really need to be able to have persons that are working with youth that are able to be well-versed in motivational interviewing, understanding cultural identity, as well as individual differences experienced by men and boys. And so let's explore understanding Bahamian boys and men. And what I'm gonna talk about right now is just to provide an opportunity to explore and understand just really some of the contextual variables or just some of the things that impact young men and boys in society. And so one of the major things, and as we talk about gender transformative education, is really looking at masculinity and the impacts of masculinity on our boys and our men. And so masculinity is essentially a set of attributes and behaviors and rules that are socially constructed. And when I say socially constructed, that essentially means that what it means to be masculine or a man in our society is could be different from a society, in Asia or in Africa or in some other country. It's sustained and maintained by the society, although there are some biological influences as well as some social conditioning that goes into how our society, our Bahamian society, may see what it means to be a man or what it means to be a boy. And so when we think of healthy masculinity, which is what we want to strive for, healthy masculinity is about really having boys and men that are able to understand their emotions, be able to express their emotions, as well as understanding their needs, their desires, and being able to treat people and everyone else with kindness, regardless of what their gender is or any other variables that may impact them, right? And so when we think of healthy masculinity, it's really looking at not using things like your strength or your size or the fact that you are a man or you have power for the purposes of getting what you want from others or getting over others. So if any of you agree with this term or agree with this definition of masculinity, feel free to give a thumbs up. So when we talk about healthy masculinity is what we want to strive for, like I said before. And it really is a matter of being able to, for boys and men to be able to accept their bodies, even if they're not perfectly sculpted, treat women and girls with the same thoughtfulness that they would want to be treated, create and maintain positive relationships and friendships, develop as emotionally available caretakers and parents to all children, accept that anger is no excuse for violence or abuse of others, experience and enjoy touch and affection with other boys and men, and create instead of destroy. And so when we think of Bahamian society and when we think of healthy masculinity, I want to ask the persons that are viewing this or receiving this information, if you feel as though striving for or having these kind of attributes as it relates to healthy masculinity would better or impact negatively our Bahamian society. So is this something that we want to strive for? Is masculinity something we want to strive for? And you can give a thumbs up or put something in the chat if you agree with something in particular that really could be a benefit to our society and our boys. You can also identify if you've ever heard of healthy masculinity, because we're also going to talk a little bit about the flip side of healthy masculinity or masculinity in general.
So we have a few people saying yes, Stephen, in the group. We have a lot of responses saying yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. So when we think about, there's a concept, when we think about gender, as I said before, it's socially defined, right? So it's what it means to be a man or masculine in the Bahamas may mean something totally different in Africa or some other country or culture. And so what you understand of the experiences of what it means to be a man is something that is very much socially constructed and conditioned. And it's conditioned by things like the culture, the context, the structures, and some of the ongoing social interactions. And so when we think of the man box, or better known as, well, it's referred to as hegemonic masculinity, which is also known as the man box. And it is a term to use that talks essentially about the dominant form of masculinity that is reinforced within a cultural context. And so this is the man box, and essentially the way that the Bahamas may view masculinity and manhood kind of creates this box, essentially. And when you think of a person trying to fit in this box, this is something that I will explore in the next slide, but it can create challenges for those that do not fit in the box, as well as other challenges as people that want to maintain the space in that box and its impact on society. And so essentially the pursuit of embodying masculinity and this ongoing attempt to do so results in men and boys that are limited by hegemonic masculinity through the policing of their behaviors, which is also referred to as violations. And so when we think of the man box, we think of these things that we expect of our boys and our men, right? And so over here, under the man box title, we see some of these things that we expect. We expect men to be leaders. We expect men to be protectors. We expect men and boys to have no weaknesses, to watch certain sports, to have material possessions, to be financially successful, and to be dominant. These are some of the hegemonic characteristics of masculinity in our Western culture or in Caribbean culture or in the Bahamas. And so when we look at, so if you agree with some of these things, or if I'm missing any, let me know if there are some other characteristics that we expect of our men to fit in this particular box. And then we can say, well, oh yes, that's a boy, or oh yes, that's a man. So if there's something that's missing, feel free to add it. If you agree that these are, a pretty comprehensive list, feel free to give me a thumbs up as well. So when we're looking at violations, as I mentioned before in the previous slide, violations are policed through homophobia and misogyny. And really what this means is that as you attempt to as a person or a man or a boy attempts to maintain their status in this man box, and to, as they continue to develop, anything that falls outside of this man box, they can receive certain comments. They can be received or perceived as acting like a girl, being emotional, being a sissy, being vulnerable, acting or being gay, or not being a real man, simply because they may not have some of these. And it may only just be one. It may be something where if they're not brave, then just because they're not brave, they're seen as violating what it means to be a man in that society, more or less. And so when we look at ways in which the man box is maintained, unfortunately, there are some ways that due to overcompensating and this ongoing strive to be a man all the time and to embody what it means to be a man, we have some of these ills that kind of show up. And this includes, things like drinking to excess, fighting, being the class clown, being aggressive towards women and girls, being aggressive towards other men, the need to always be seen and to be tough, stealing, sweethearting, boys, and we say things like boys will be boys. And so when you think of some of the boys you may work with, or just society, our society in general, when you think of people that, or men or boys that want to always be seen as manly or seen as dominant, if you agree with some of these ways that it kind of falls apart, let me know in the comments, give us some thumbs up as it relates to how this box is maintained, what it means to be a man, when it kind of teeters over, maintaining this man box can kind of play out in this way. And so something that is important for us to understand is a quote that I found as I was putting this together. And it's the idea that boys won't be boys. Boys will be what we teach them to be. What we teach boys is what becomes our men. And so just to kind of go back to the man box, if we continue to support and push, boys to maintain this box and this space, they become these men that are continuously striving towards trying to maintain this box. And unfortunately, as research shows, and as we can see in some of our classrooms and society, they kind of play out in this way. All right, so something that's also important to explore is hyper and hypomasculinity. And these essentially discuss the binary or the opposite ends of the spectrum as it relates to masculinity. And so hyper masculinity is essentially the exaggeration or the overcompensation of masculine or male stereotypical behaviors. So these things may include being strong and being aggressive and being emotionally unavailable, as well as a continued focus on sexuality or sexual conquest. These may be the guys or the boys that play basketball and play all the sports and get all the girls, but they kind of overzealous about this as a part of their identity. And then when we think of hypo-masculinity, it's essentially the direct opposite. So it may be, for example, the de-emphasizing of feelings or relationship or emotional expression, right? And so these may be those boys that we may consider, they may be soft or they may be feminine, but they essentially exhibit less traits that are not seen by the culture as being masculine or manly. And like I said, this is opposite ends of the spectrum, but it is a continuum. But a lot of times, like I mentioned before, masculinity marginalizes persons that may be hypomasculine, so that don't show those stereotypical behaviors. And you may see those boys that are getting picked on in class because they may be a little bit skinnier, or their voice may be a little bit softer, because they're essentially not showing these traits, because everyone is trying, all the boys are trying to fit into this box. They want to be the man, Ice Man and the man on the playground or whatever have you, or the boy or the biggest and the baddest. And so those that don't fit into that essentially become marginalized, and these create different challenges. And so what's also important to explore and discuss is when we talk about power, privilege, and positionality, right? And so when we think of gender power, it essentially is the idea that the power that exists simply as a result of being a male or a female, and how that is kind of used throughout society, whether it's deciding policies and procedures, laws, or whatever should happen during crises, or just regular legislature in general. When we talk about privilege, privilege is essentially benefits that you enjoy. Oh, I'm sorry. Benefits that one enjoys beyond others. Simply, it may just happen as a result of being a boy or being born a boy. And so, if you could think of some of those privileges that boys have, please give us some comments in the box. I know I have a younger sister, and there were some things that I could do at a certain age that she couldn't do at the same age, or even just a perspective that was had of me versus her. So if you can think of some of those privileges that boys may have over girls, or boys may have in the classroom over girls, on other genders, feel free to type some of those in the box as well. And so when we think of positionality, positionality really means where in space are you? So when it comes to your race, your class, your gender, all of these other things, all of those kind of cultivate a particular lens that you have, a way in which you view the world, right? And so if you have things like gendered power and privilege, and you don't experience things like, for example, menstruation, as an example, if you don't experience those things, your positionality to be able to identify legislature and laws and procedures or what have you will be a little bit skewed, because you don't have a personal or vested interest in what it means to experience those things as a female. And so that's when we talk about positionality, your space and what cultivates the lens in which you move through the world. And so when we think about going back to previous slide to gender transformative education, having our boys understand what it means to be a girl and masculinity and be in society and whatever have you, having boys that grow up understanding the plight and the challenges that girls and women experience, they become the same political leaders that are able to set legislature that is, informed from both points of view, or all points of view. So that's just an example of how positionality is important to be able to explore. So toxic masculinity essentially is this idea that, when we're trying to, or when men and boys are trying to display masculinity, it's kind of the fallout. And so kind of going back to what maintains that man box, and toxic masculinity becomes toxic, or masculinity becomes toxic when boys and men feel that they need to conform to that man box by any means necessary, and regardless of whom it impacts. And so if you agree with this definition or this concept, or if you've heard of toxic masculinity before, please feel free to leave a comment in the chat below. And so as we talk about reinforcing masculinity and what it means to be a boy and a man in Bahamian society, we also understand, or we need to understand this quote, which I found as well, which states, when the pursuit and sustainment of masculinity impedes the safety and liberties of others, we must reevaluate what is being pursued. And so we can take a moment to kind of let that sit in. But when we encourage boys to be boys and men to be men, and we expect this, that, and the third, what are they trying to, in order to sustain this, how is this impacting our society in general? And so as we look at, working with boys, research shows that motivational interviewing, and if you're familiar with motivational interviewing, but motivational interviewing is one of the key tools to be able to use with boys as we try to engage them in ways, in any particular way, whether it could be something as significant as, they are high risk, and if you're familiar with risk, but maybe engaging in violence and, at school or at home or whatever have you, and even something that may be considered a little bit small risk or lower risk, which may just be they're not completing their homework on time, or they're not as engaged in the classroom, right? And so motivational interviewing essentially is a counseling style, or a youth-centered counseling style, that helps to elicit and change behaviors that are being explored by youth in order to resolve ambivalence. And so during motivational interviewing, you want to use some of those communication skills that Dr. Nyambi brought up earlier, but really to use empathic listening as an essential form to minimize resistance. And so what you want to do is you want to ensure that boys feel accepted for who they are and what they do, no matter how unhealthy or detrimental it allows them or detrimental, sorry, it allows them the freedom to consider change rather than needing to defend against it. And so motivational interviewing really supports with kind of having that intrinsic motivation to either change or maintain or move forward or set goals or whatever have you. And so when we're thinking about motivational interviewing skills, you want to be able to assess for change talk. And change talk is essentially this idea of having youth being able to reveal or discuss or talk about consideration for, motivation of, motivation for, or even just a commitment to change. And so what you really want to do is guide the youth, not tell them, but guide the youth towards a pathway to change or setting goals or whatever have you, because it's going to be important for them to intrinsically be able to do this so that they're not, dependent on you, or so that they're able to really move forward and commit to change by themselves, even when you're not around. And so change talk consists of preparatory change talk, which essentially, as it says, is preparing to change, and mobilizing change talk, which is taking actions towards changing. So when we're talking about preparatory change talk, this is the type of things that you want to elicit or you really want to hear when you're working with boys. But to be clear, this can be used across all genders, but I know I'm talking about boys today. So when we're talking about preparatory change talk, we want to hear I want to, that desire to change. We want to hear I can, having them be empowered to say I have the ability to change. We want to have them identify concrete reasons as though they're as towards why it is good to change, and identifying a need. So what is the need for them? I really need to change. And so mobilizing change talk really talks about, hearing and eliciting their ability to commit to the change. So I'm going to do this. Activation is I'm ready to do this, and taking steps. And that's really towards, actually and intentionally getting some stuff done. But in order for any kind of change to be effective, or any support that you're giving the boys to be effective, is that they have to be able to see themselves as able to do it, willing to do it, and ready to do it. And so we have to be mindful as adults to not push on to boys to change, but rather empower them to change, or empower them to strive for greatness or success or whatever have you in whatever situation is happening in your classrooms or wherever you are. And so as we kind of taper off into the end of my presentation, I want to continue to talk about, when you're assessing confidence and motivation to change. And so you want to be able to engage in open conversation. You want to just try to be as open as possible, really taking boys for where they are and not looking at whatever behavior is happening as, we want to look at the behavior. We don't want to look at boys as inherently bad. We do want to look at, the behaviors or whatever it is, if it is a bad behavior or if it is a behavior that is not helping them in an effective way. You want to be able to focus on a set agenda, which really is to articulate, what is the purpose of why you're in my office right now, right? What is the purpose, or do they know what the purpose is? But really having them to understand and develop that insight as you look towards whatever the challenge, or even whether it's large or small, as you're working with boys. And so when you're using motivational interviewing, remember the acronym rule. And so R is to resist telling them what to do, U is to understand their motivations, L is to listen with empathy, E is to empower them. Remember, you want to really use this rule to be able to support our boys. And then throughout the motivational interviewing, you want to be able to use affirmations, use reflective listening, summarizations, empathy, all of those awesome skills that Dr. Nyambi brought up in their presentation at the beginning of the session. And this is kind of the spirit in which you want to engage in talking with boys, but you really want to be intentional about this. And so as we talk about resistance trap, because we may experience some of these resistance traps, these are some things to avoid. And so you want to avoid just spitfire question and answer scenarios, taking sides or pouncing on some information that's being provided by the boy. And especially one in particular is forced planning. So forcing someone or forcing a boy or man to do something, even though you already recognize that they are not able, they are not willing, and they are not ready to change or make whatever needs to happen. Okay, and so as I wrap up with this, I want to ask you all in the chat, if you are familiar with motivational interviewing, do you think this can be effective in some of the work that you do? Was this rule effective? Do you see how it can play out as you seek to support our boys and men in any of the work that you do? I'd love to hear some of those in the chat. But that concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. We do have some comments in the chat already. No questions yet, but guys, the floor is open for you. If you have any questions for Stephen, please use this time right now to type your questions in the chat. In the interim, I'm going to read to you some of the comments that were posted during your actual presentation, Stephen, okay? And I know one of the questions you asked was when you were talking about the things that boys can get away with that girls essentially can't get away with. So we have Kelly, who's very vocal, like she said. They can go out at a younger age. They can be in a relationship at a younger age. They don't have to cook and wake up early on a Saturday to clean. But even to add on to what Kelly is saying, a lot of the domestic responsibilities fall to girls versus young boys. And so Rhonda said essentially be in the house so curfew, like curfew is not a thing. So girls had maybe even if they had curfew, girls' curfews were earlier than young boys. Never let Pierce, girls are often raised by women, taught by women, and have several positive female role models in their lives. These give them an advantage over boys. It helps them to feel better about themselves and motivates them to excel academically and lead in their peer groups. Edwin Martin has a case. Boys receive MI at school. They identify purpose, why they want to change. But when they return to environment, they go back to past behaviors. So the environmental conditions is essentially what he's talking about. And Gary says, totally agree, because every behavior is a way of them communicating to us. Then we have some other comments. Great presentation, great presentation, very informative, as of course it was. I told you guys it was going to be good. Glendina says, I've not heard of MI. May I see an example, please? Carla Thinker says, thank you all, awesome presentation. And so what Glendina is meaning is, like, if you could give her an example of a conversation using the tools of MI.
Yeah, so definitely I can do that. So Karen, if you will role play with me for a second. So I'll set the stage. You are not coming to school, or maybe you're the class clown, right? Right. So you're the class clown. And so I'm asking conversations or questions, and I'm just, asking, so Karen, I want you to tell me what's going on. Like, what is the reason why you got everyone laughing in the class all the time? You sit at the back of the classroom. Help me understand what that is. What's going on there?
I'm just naturally gifted as a comedian. I can't help it if I'm funny. I'm making them laugh. They're laughing on their own.
Right. And so what I'm hearing is, are you saying that you kind of get something out of making everyone laugh, right? You get all the girls laughing, you get all the boys laughing, the teacher might laugh every now and then. Is that what I'm hearing?
I mean, that wasn't what I was saying, but if that's what you hear.
No, and that's fair, But what I want to understand is that, if you are doing that, do you see any challenges I could have when the teacher has to continue to keep the class quiet, or people aren't paying attention to the class? Do you see any challenges to any of your peers, or maybe to yourself in that situation?
I mean, yeah, I can see where she may feel, I wasting the class time, but it ain't like I needed to do it.
Right. And so what do you think would be a better scenario in that situation? What is something else that you can do? No? Got
Save,
nothing for me?
save one joke at the beginning of the class, one joke at the end.
Okay, so we could probably work at that. So it sounds like, instead of, having the whole class cracking up the whole time, maybe you save one for the beginning and one for the end. But so during the time when you're not cracking the jokes, what would you be doing in class instead?
I mean, if she ain't boring, I'd be paying attention.
Okay, so it sounds like paying attention could be helpful to do for the rest of that time in class. So maybe you could pay attention a little bit, not be too disruptive to the rest of the classroom. That sounds good to me. Can so you have class with Miss Carey tomorrow. Do you think you could do that tomorrow? Is that something that you would be able to do tomorrow?
I could try.
And that's all I could ask from you, right? Is to try. If you could try and get it done, if you could do it, if you could get it done, and that's the best that we can do. And then if it doesn't work out, as long as you're trying, that's all we could ask for, right? If you sound like you're able to do it, you sound like you could be ready to do it tomorrow, and then you're gonna put it into work. So just two jokes, not the whole time, just two jokes, like you said. And then that would kind of be NCing, but that would kind of be how I would kind of go through on a motivational interviewing. Remind you now, I didn't try to push what they said. I did put concept in the air. If you have someone that is quiet and is kind of like, oh, I don't know, or they're just staying into this, but really have them to be empowered and say, well, are they able? So I was able to hear she was able, because two jokes, instead of saying, well, no, I got to make everyone laugh the whole time, she was able to say two jokes, as well as to be able to say, we gave it a little bit of a time. So tomorrow is a time when it can be done. So you can see it being done. And then you identify being ready-ish, I could try. And that's the kind of language you want to be able to hear. Instead of me saying, now Karen, tomorrow, don't be ruining Miss Carey class, you're disrupting all, like, that's not going to help. And so really getting them to be empowered to say, okay, well, I got this, I can do this, and kind of come up with it themselves.
Okay, and so just to move on with some of the comments and questions that are in the chat. Macintosh is asking, Mr. Thompson, do you have a program in place for high school boys that students can be referred to? Essentially a document that, hey, this is what I can give to my student or refer to my students who I feel may benefit from it.
Yeah, so like I said, like you mentioned, Karen, so I do work with boys and young men. So I do take on individual and group clients myself, where I work specifically with boys that may be high risk, low risk, or whatever have you, by providing telehealth counseling.
From Nyambi, she says, thank you so much, Stephen. As education is overwhelmingly female, how can we make sure to take notice of some of the issues you raised?
We'll definitely continue to do research. I mean, I think as educators, we have to continue to stay informed on the practices as it relates to gender transformative education. So even as this may be your first seed of hearing that, but I implore you and I encourage you all to do some research and see what it is. There are so many different levels to gender informative education, and then it'll increase what you're able to see in the classroom. It'll increase what you're able to see in the boys in your family. It'll just really help to contextualize how you're receiving the world and moving through the world.
Yvonne Ward, I think we need to be careful comparing boys to girls, thinking that they are broken girls that need to be fixed because they do not behave like the girls in our classrooms. Glendina says, thank you for the new information. Joanne Brown says, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for the new information. Yvonne was actually making a suggestion to ask them to share a joke in the class. Teacher may find it funny. Glendina said, this is cool. I like this. Can we use this approach with the male juvenile offenders? That's what Joanne is asking you.
Yeah, so definitely. So I was actually trained on using motivational interviewing in a juvenile detention center when I was working in Chicago. So that was because you want them to be intrinsically be able to make the change themselves, because like I think a comment earlier mentioned, going back into the environment or having to have me there, if it can be intrinsic, then it isn't a matter of what's going on and not going on around them, because they know for themselves what they need to do. So I don't need to be there for them to stay on the right path, because they have themselves and they can lean on themselves. And so definitely can be used in all really situations. And even when you even think of using it on yourself as you're trying to identify changing your own goals or whatnot, but definitely can be used with the juvenile justice population as well.
Okay. All right. So just a few more comments. We got some credit for our little skit. So let's see what's well done, Karen. And Stephen and Yvonne says great exchange. Gary Lewis, again, was just giving a suggestion based on the question that was asked where we role played. I'm asking him to come up with upfront and share the joke with all of us. If he does not want to, then explain to him that this is distracting and how would he feel if it was being interrupted while teaching and the student that is annoyed of his jokes.
So if I could go on that a little bit, I would push back on that, Gary. And just because what you want to do, or at least want to avoid doing, is creating a situation where now you're creating power struggles between you and that youth, right? So telling them, oh, well, come up here and tell this joke in front of the class, putting them on the spot or whatever, have you can essentially create a power struggle where, now you have, if you even play that out in your head, how many times is that boy going to really come up from the back of the classroom to the front of the classroom and now tell this joke in the front of the class? I mean, it could depend, but you don't want to put them on kind of on blast, essentially, because you're going to embarrass them, or it could embarrass them, or even what might happen is that if it turns out to be a great situation, he shares that joke, then now you're reinforcing a behavior that you don't want to have, right? You now give them this platform to crack this joke or whatever have you in front of the group, and then now that's something that he's even feel more reinforced to do. So this is why you may more likely want to pull that person to the side, pull that youth to the side, because like we've been saying, whatever's going on, even that class clown situation is a way of communication. So it could be, and in situations that I've worked in, is that it could be, they're trying to distract everyone else from the fact that they don't know what's going on. They don't know what's going on in the classroom. They probably can't see the board, whatever have you. And so, it is a method that they're doing it for, but you really want to be invested in trying not to embarrass or trying not to tell them what it is, tell them that you're annoyed, or tell them this, like ask them how they feel as though people may receive that, and how it's like how I said is, how do you think it's impacting everyone that's in the classroom? Are they able to get their work done or whatever have you?
Okay. So thank you so much for that, Yvonne Ward. Motivational interviewing is so empowering for the young men. They not only get to discover who they are, but they provide self-reflection and unknowingly self-help. Gary Lewis, I would pull him up to the side before I ask him to come up. So that was his response to
okay.
you just said.
That could be it as well.
Yeah. And I think it also depends on the relationship that you have already established with the student. Because they'll understand where you're coming from, as well as, sometimes just by asking him to do that, we make him realize, all right, I need to chill out. Let me take a step back because, Mr. Lewis is not in the mood, or he's being, he's being frustrated by my cracking of jokes right now. So let me ease up. And that's why, again, going back to what we talked about in the earlier presentations, the importance of forming those relationships with your students very early on, so that there is a level of communication that transcends the, going to the office, or, there being a power struggle within the classroom, or embarrassing, someone. So the relationship really, really is important from the very beginning.
Definitely.
Stephen, that was extremely good, very informative. And so the question that I have before we move on, and we don't have to give responses, but I challenge you more than a question to think about how we, within our homes, within our families, within our classrooms, can begin to change the narrative of what it means to be a man or a male within our culture. Because make no mistake, we do have the power. And as women too, we also perpetuate some of cultural stereotypes that come along with what we expect from a man, but at the same time are very frustrated in our relationships and interactions with men when we don't get what we want, right? But we play such a pivotal role in how we raise our men, how we treat our boys, how we communicate with them. And so I challenge you all to think about how we interact with men, with young boys, within our families, within our homes, within our classrooms, so that we can begin to change this narrative.
Definitely.
So with that said, thank you again, Stephen. Thank you everyone for paying attention and participating.